If you spend any time in the land of gender confusion, there's a common question you'll hear asked among bewildered people. How on earth did we get here? The assault of gender ideology on natural reason, that we must deny what we see with our eyes, that a man is woman if he says he is, no questions asked, is so profound it precipitates further questions about what led to this insanity. It didn't emerge from a vacuum. To be sure, there are many contributing factors, with industries and professionals colluding in a way that has enabled this diabolical ideology to escalate with remarkable speed. And in this season finale of Generation Indoctrination, we'll conclude by engaging some of these often uncomfortable questions. Especially in America, where culture wars over hot-button social issues typically rage, engaging these touchy themes is a daunting task and not for the faint of heart. But it's nevertheless important to go there, particularly breaking down the core roots of the issue. Since the 1960s, the sexual revolution has fundamentally altered the relational landscape. In the age of supposedly free love, there's been a multi-generational cost, upending the lives of countless men and women who today find themselves profoundly confused about who they are and unable to form stable relationships and families, many of whom now count themselves among the LGBTQ community. And while a few LGB-identified dissenters have emerged in recent years to object to transgender ideology, a few of whom we've interviewed in this podcast series, all the major gay rights groups have been at the forefront of transgender activism. Why is that? Are we allowed to ask? And more broadly, how did supposed sexual liberation result in children and teens being chemically castrated and surgically mutilated? One of the best, most articulate voices who dares to write about these themes is Canadian journalist Jonathon Van Maren, the host of the Jonathon Van Maren Show and a frequent contributor at the European Conservative. He also writes a blog called The Bridgehead. I asked him to set the stage and describe the bigger picture. So, Jonathon, I know you've written a lot about this, and I consider you to be one of the most eloquent voices on the scene, and there are many layers to this, and I don't want to bite off more than I can chew here, but in the broadest possible terms, when we consider the sexual revolution as this whole totalizing cultural force, how would you say that it has fueled the current chaos we see today of 75 different gender options you can pick from, and why and how has it swept a generation of youth into its dragnet?
This is a fascinating question because the transgender movement is presented by its leaders as a continuation, essentially, of the sexual revolution. And the sexual revolution was a revolution. It was the tearing down of all boundaries surrounding what is sex, what is procreation, what is family. And so the sexual revolution from its very beginning redefined everything about human relationships. And it was, to a degree, inevitable that eventually they would begin to redefine the very concept of self to begin with, especially because the sexual revolution redefined who we are in relation to other people. And it's also really important to point out that the pedigree of transgenderism, which we could largely ignore for many, many decades, and the pedigree of sexual revolutionaries, it is the same pedigree. We just didn't notice the crazier gender ideas of the sexual revolutionaries until much later because, frankly, we didn't have to. None of us, I think, even in the year 2005 or 10, could have imagined a future where we see children being physically mutilated, placed on puberty blockers, and essentially undergoing procedures that render them infertile and incapable of experiencing any form of sexual pleasure before they're old enough to drink, drive, or vote.
So do you think that the dysfunction it has created has now gotten so undeniable that we now see voices that are not religiously motivated social conservatives, but think of left-wing types like J.K. Rowling and other writers like feminist Louise Perry, who wrote a book a few years ago called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. She's now speaking out against it. Do you think this points to a larger scale reckoning?
This is a fascinating question because I have often stated that the sexual revolution is the bloodiest revolution in all of human history. And that's because in every Western country where a sexual revolution took place, about 10 years later, abortion was legalized. Because as it turns out, contraception and the pill cannot prevent babies from being conceived. Babies that are conceived in so-called casual coitus are going to be, by definition, unwanted or unexpected. And so the abortion industry was necessary essentially to mop up the natural consequences of sex, which we had collectively decided didn't actually exist. We talked about recreational sex, even though we have recreational organs. But the pro-life movement has faced the uphill task of taking silent and unseen victims and presenting them to the public so that the public can understand that the sexual revolution is in fact a bloody revolution. Now what we see with transgenderism is something different, is that these victims are very much alive. They very much have voices. The barbarism perpetrated against the bodies of these primarily young people can be witnessed by all, and those people can articulate those experiences. And so I do think that we may be at this stage that you see in many revolutions when the spell breaks and we start to realize for the first time just how horrifying this revolution has been since inception. And that in fact, mutilating the bodies of children, perpetrating harm against the very young is not actually an exception to the rule. This has been done since the birth of this revolution. And in fact, the success of this revolution is premised on being able to destroy the bodies of children. You and I have both spoken to many people who have undergone the horrors of gender transition, so-called, and many of those people are starting to ask, if we got this so wrong, what else might we have gotten wrong? And the victims of the transgender industry, I think, are the most prominent example of that.
In 1934, author J.D. Unwin traced the history of what we're speaking about today and published a book called Sex and Culture, in which he detailed how sexual hedonism destroys cultures. A crucial finding in his work was that once a society abandoned chastity in favor of hedonism, without fail, it collapsed within a few generations and was taken over by a new social energy. All this begs the question, is the secularized post-sexual revolutionary West now at the precipice?
What we are currently experiencing as a culture, and that more and more people are willing to say out loud, is that although the Christian sexual ethic is obviously tremendously difficult, in my view, of course, theological reasons for that, because I believe in the Christian sexual ethic, which comes as part of a larger theological package. I think that what we are all seeing collectively now is that the only thing harder than a society that orients itself towards the Christian sexual ethic is one that does not. And so while it is true to say that the Christian sexual ethic, because everybody struggles against the flesh, is going to be an ethic that everybody who strives towards it will have their failings, and that these failings are to a degree inevitable, that a society striving in the opposite direction to do away with the Christian ethic in every way brings upon itself horrors that would have been unimaginable even by some of those who were proponents of this revolution to begin with. And so let's just take a look at a handful of things that we now see. The sexual revolution has brought us a culture in which divorce is normative and in which children do not experience the inherent safety that usually comes when they are being raised by a mother and father who love each other. And of course, the parents always excuse this by saying, the kids are happier. No, they're not. They couldn't care less about your personal sexual fulfillment. What they want is the two halves of their world that protect them from the world outside are still above their head. Second of all, we see the enormous amount of pain and trauma brought about by abortion, which is actually far more keenly noticed now that the abortion pill is over 50% of abortions in the United States, where you see Reddit forums of women actually talking about delivering their babies into toilets and seeing their heartbeat for the last time. They are now, because of the abortion pill, coming face to face with the consequences and the reality of abortion that the abortion clinics worked so hard to shield them from. We see a generation that is so addicted to pornography that we have the highest rates of erectile dysfunction in young men under 30 in all of recorded history. This was not previously a problem with young men under 30, as I'm sure all the listeners can understand. We are seeing now a culture that has essentially wired its libido to violent digital porn content that is now fueling, I think, an entire culture on the degradation and sexual abuse of women. And as a final point, a listener might justifiably be asking, well, how does this all tie into the insanity of the transgender movement? Well, we're seeing a large spike in young women who are identifying as non-binary, not because they don't feel like they're female, but because they're rejecting their femininity, because a culture is answering Matt Walsh's question, what is a woman, by watching Pornhub. And when they see how our culture is defining a woman, they want no part of it. They don't want to become male. They want to escape their femininity. And so maybe those asking what's next might look at the world that we have created and decide that the Christian ethic may be difficult, but the only thing more difficult than the Christian ethic is the hellish chaos we have created for upcoming generations today.
It does indeed seem that in light of the dystopian results that gender ideology has produced, we've reached the dead end of the revolution. How much worse can it get than permanently sterile and surgically disfigured children and young people, not to mention their shattered families? Van Maren is far from the only one asking these deeper questions. I also spoke with Nathanael Blake, a fellow with the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and the author of the 2025 book, Victims of the Revolution: How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. I asked him specifically, while the infamous 1960s were not the first time in history when society-wide hedonism manifested on a large scale, it is the one that remains in our collective memory. So what was the central appeal of this modern sexual revolutionary ethos?
The sexual revolution promised that if we pursued pleasure and disregarded commitments and obligations, we would be freer, more authentic, and happier. And part of that was to say that our bodies do not matter, that male and female, there's nothing about them that requires us to come together for our flourishing, for the good of our children, and so on. But instead, if we could move in and out of relationships in whatever combinations we felt like, we would be happier. So men and women, of course, could jump in and out of marriages. They could jump in and out of short-term relationships. They could hook up. Men could hook up with men. Women could hook up with women. As long as it felt good and you weren't punching somebody in the face, it was acceptable. It was moral. Our bodies did not indicate anything about how we should come together in what Christians would say Christian marriage, long-term relationships that are dedicated to a lifelong union, to each other in fidelity, and for the good of children that naturally result from the union of men and women. So if you say that that doesn't matter, that there's no meaning to sex other than what you happen to feel about it, if you think there's meaning, great. If you don't think there's meaning, well, that's fine too. That necessarily means that male and female don't matter. So same-sex marriage was sold to us as almost a conservative thing. Well, they just want to get married like everyone else and settle down. But if male and female don't matter in marriage, they don't matter anywhere. That's where they are, perhaps they're most important, is in the joining of the two halves of the human race. So that is the logical way that this unfolded. And then, of course, the legal and cultural way was as soon as same-sex marriage came down, there was an immediate pivot by all the groups, all the activists, with very few exceptions, to transgenderism. So it was very intentionally part of the same movement at a practical level. And that's because it followed at an ideological level. If men and women don't matter, then they really don't matter. And you can be a man or a woman however you feel like. You can change between them. You can get whatever surgeries you want to your body, even if you're a child, because your body doesn't have any meaning other than that which you assign it.
Proponents of quote-unquote liberation say that the sexual revolution is the boogeyman excuse that social conservatives use as a catch-all for all the ills of modern society, when in fact there are many contributing factors that have surrounded the gender mania. And you'll find that while there may be connective threads as the revolution keeps going like a train with no brakes, very few people seem to be on board with the whole thing. What do you make of the internal contradictions within it, Nathanael? What's that about?
Well, I think the natural law finds a way. Humans are made to flourish. Even in this fallen world, we will do better if we avoid sin and pursue the good. And therefore, even people who are endorsing parts of the sexual revolution will often recognize that other portions of it are wrong and damaging to others, to those who practice them. So I view this as a confirmation that almost nobody, I should say, wants to go all the way to the bottom of the slippery slope. But the slope is slippery, and we've seen that. It's not a fallacy, it's a prediction at this point, that what social conservative Christians say is going to happen will probably be the next step. And the reason for that is once you abandon the normative anthropology, to put it in big terms, but basically once you abandon the idea that human beings have a particular nature, and as Christians we would say given to us by God, and that we are meant to live in certain ways in accordance with the creation order, you don't have a good place to build on. You don't have a firm foundation. You don't have the footing to resist the slippery slope and dig in and stop. You may recognize that parts of this are bad. I welcome any allies we can have in resisting gender ideology, and especially what it does to children. But my challenge to these people would be, I'm so glad you're here, but please give some thought to what is the basis for what we are meant to live like as men, as women, what our bodies mean. It's wrong to mutilate our bodies, but what does that then tell us about what they are meant for? What is the good that we are to pursue in our bodily existence?
Martin Luther King Jr. once said that evil cannot permanently organize. It bears within it seeds of its own destruction. But is that also true of the sexual revolution? Is it true that those who have feverishly pushed the gender movement, none other than one of the most infamous trans activist pediatricians in the country, Dr. Joanna Olson Kennedy, who's legally married to a woman who claims to be a man, has been seen on tape claiming that a male-bodied person with a female gender identity may have a stepping stone period where they come out as gay? Again, a seeming internal contradiction, correct? Or is this something that the revolutionary train barreled down the tracks to support? Some people say they are fine with the LGB, but the T is too far. What's that about?
The T says, I want to be free from my body. My desire is not to indulge in some bodily thing so much as to be free from my body and to have a different body in accord with my desires. So the one can flow from the other, but then it does turn against that source that it came from. We've actually seen this in the accounts of some detransitioners who have talked about how pornography in various forms was part of their transition, especially for some of the male detransitioners who tried to live as women for a while. They will recount how they were both attracted to this various forms of pornography that glorify or eroticize transition and transgenderism, but they were also somewhat repulsed by it. And so their transition was both they were drawn to it, and yet it was also a way to try to flee from that which they were drawn to. So it can get very psychologically complex, but at the root, it's this idea of the body doesn't matter. And Christians, in contrast, would say, no, our bodies are very important. And we would emphasize the incarnation. Jesus had a body. Jesus has a body. God has a body, a resurrected, glorified human body for all eternity. That is the glorious mystery of the incarnation and the resurrection. And therefore, what we do with our bodies, as the Apostle Paul teaches us, matters enormously. They are not disposable. Yes, these current physical bodies will die, but we will be given new bodies in the kingdom of God to know and love God forever, to be part of his kingdom. And so, yes, our bodies are incredibly important because of that in the Christian perspective. And theologians and pastors could unpack that far more. But Christians emphasize our bodies matter, and they were meant for a purpose. They were created for a purpose by God. They are not simply meat sacks that we have a soul driving around, and then eventually that soul goes off and leaves them and is pure. Right? That's sort of Platonic ideal, but that's not the Christian ideal. The Christian ideal is, no, your body will be resurrected and perfected in glory.
So Nathanael, why do you think this revolution happened at all? What is it fundamentally about?
Why did the sexual revolution happen? Well, we thought we could get away with it because we suddenly had technological advancements and economic advancements. We were richer, so it didn't seem like it would be nearly as harmful to have marriages break apart and husbands and wives separate, because they could still both be economically supported. Likewise, we had penicillin. Syphilis was no longer a death sentence. Right before there was AIDS, there was syphilis, but penicillin cured that, and then other antibiotics for other less deadly STDs. But it seemed like the specter of venereal disease was gone when that had haunted, say, earlier efforts at sexual liberation. Likewise, pregnancy, the risk of an unwanted pregnancy seemed vastly reduced by cheap, effective condoms and, above all, the pill. So these technological and economic changes made it seem plausible that, yes, we could have free love, free sexuality, and there wouldn't be the same natural consequences that there would have been in an earlier period of human history, where if you got a disease, you got a disease, where if you got pregnant, you were pregnant, and so on.
I also spoke with Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse, founder and president of the Ruth Institute, and the author of The Sexual State: How Elite Ideologies Are Destroying Lives and Why the Church Was Right All Along. What does she make of these emerging contradictions that seem to be part and parcel of the sexual revolution?
This is a great question, Brandon, because not too long ago I gave a talk at Live Action, Lila Rose's outfit, that she had 1,500 wild-eyed, crazy, excited pro-life youth, people from age 14 to 35 or something, and this very point came up. Particularly the gender ideology has one contradiction after another. Marriage is an oppressive, patriarchal institution that we would be well rid of, but for lesbians and gay men, it's absolutely essential that they have the right to marry. What? It's like one thing after another. It's like that. And so I think the reason is because the underlying first principle is incorrect. It's just going to keep spinning off contradictions, one after another. The first contradiction is going to contradict the subsequent contradictions. That's why it's important to look at this fundamental premise that we're at war with male and female. We're at war with the human body. And as long as we're at war with that, we're going to be chasing our tails. We're going to be creating one bit of craziness after another. We're going to contradict ourselves because you cannot really, truly form a society around the idea that the body is disposable and still have human people, walking around. And it's getting darker and darker as we go along, the things that people are trying to do to make the ideology work. That's the way I look at it. If we had put a stop to it way back in 1973 or something, there's no way we would be talking about puberty blockers in 2025, right? The further it goes, the worse and more dark and more ugly it's going to be. So there's that point. The other point that I want to mention is that the process of going from Obergefell to where we are today is very striking. And I didn't realize this, even myself, I didn't realize this, because I was very involved in the debate over redefining marriage. And of course, I anticipated that the court would rule as it did, and I was following it closely, but I wasn't really tracking what the next step was going to be. Only a few people really tracked that transgenderism was around the corner. But the person who called it to my attention was an Alliance Defending Freedom attorney called John Birch, who has a nice book out about the trans issue, and I interviewed him for that. And in the course of that interview, Brandon, he said to me, within weeks after Obergefell, there were transgender cases popping up all over the country. My docket was full. 80% of my docket, all of a sudden, was trans cases. And I said, wow, now that you say that, that's kind of interesting. So I went back and I did some checking, and Obergefell was June 26th, 2015. That same weekend was released the July issue of Vanity Fair, which had Bruce Jenner on the cover. I think it came out June 27th, and it was the July issue, something like that. But literally, the same weekend, Bruce Jenner's on the cover, calling himself Caitlyn. And within 2 weeks of that, I Am Jazz reality TV show premieres on, I think, July 14th, something like that. Okay, within 2 weeks. So what does that tell you? It tells you, number one, these people knew how the court was going to rule. And number two, they had transgenderism up their sleeves the whole time. Oddly enough, when they were campaigning for the redefinition of marriage, none of them mentioned that. I was there, and I don't remember anyone saying the next step is we're coming for your sex organs, people. No. Carefully, there were no drag queens in the commercials in favor of gay marriage, okay? I don't know if anybody remembers that, but it was always very non-threatening looking female couples with their children. That's who you saw in the commercials to show you how non-threatening redefining marriage was. And do you notice they never called it lesbian marriage? It was either always same-sex marriage or gay marriage. It was never lesbian marriage. It never said that. So I feel like the lesbians have a right to be angry that they were used, that they were co-opted in some way. You used our pictures in your commercials to make everybody feel safe, and then you turn around and give the country drag queens and Bruce Jenner in a dress. That's what you do to us. That's how you throw us under the bus.
Well, I know it's politically incorrect to discuss, but so much of the discourse around these issues center on this baseline assumption that our sense of human selfhood is psychologized. It's a distorted construction of who we are, but it's just in the air we breathe, the water we drink. And so regardless of the body's physical, anatomical structure, a gender or sexual self-concept, for all intents and purposes, rules the day. And yet, do you think we even know how to entertain the idea that we are not the sum total of our psychological feelings and inclinations, gender, sexual, or otherwise?
I think this is a really important point, Brandon. I have taken to saying to young people, I'm going to say this to anybody who's listening right now. No matter what you may be feeling about your patterns of sexual attraction or your understanding of yourself and your relationship to your own body, whatever you're feeling today, I want you to understand that this is not the final word about your identity. It's something you're feeling. It's something that's going on now. And people change all the time. You know, the reality is most people aren't the same person today that they were when they were 13 years old. When you're 13, you're not really as smart as you think you are. And you're not nearly as self-aware as you think you are. But the problem is during puberty, you are changing rapidly. You don't really understand yourself very well. And your feelings are very powerful. And so it feels like it's easiest to go along with the idea that these feelings somehow identify you or these feelings somehow are your essence because it's on your mind all the time. Well, that just means you're 13. It doesn't mean that you're gay or straight or anything. It doesn't mean you're a pervert if you're having really weird things coming into your mind. A lot of kids have really weird things coming into their mind. And so you don't want to put too much emphasis on that. And what I think is tragic is that adult society has hijacked that process. And instead of helping young people develop in a normal path to come out of the other end of puberty with a sense of themselves as a mature man or a mature woman who's capable of interacting with men and women alike in a normal manner and choosing a partner for life who is of the opposite sex, instead, that is in fact normative. That is normal statistically. It is normative in the sense of being good for us. Instead of allowing that process, encouraging that process, young people have been hijacked right at the moment when they're vulnerable, and that all those questions and all that intensity and all those fears and anxiety, that's all being steered down a very particular path. And honestly, as the Lord is just, some of these people are going to be in for a very dark reckoning someday. That's all I can say. I don't know that you or I or anybody on this planet Earth can do full justice to correct the injustice that is being done to young people today. But the Lord will, and He knows everything and He'll handle it. I just have to believe that He's going to somehow handle it. Yeah, I just want to caution young people, don't let yourself go down that path. Find somebody that you trust, that you can confide in, and allow them to guide you towards a healthy development for your sex.
And what about the people who saw this from the inside? What about those who were once a part of the LGBTQ community who came to understand themselves outside of modernist sexual self-concepts? I spoke with two such voices, one man and one woman. Joseph Sciambra is an Eastern Orthodox Christian who spent many years living and identifying as a gay man. He was even involved in homosexual pornography. In his early days of coming to Christ, he would do ministry on the streets and share the love of Jesus with anyone who would listen, including gays, lesbians, and what were then known as transsexuals. I asked him specifically what that was like when he would encounter those people in the streets of San Francisco.
You know, it was interesting. In the 90s, I went to Gay Pride in San Francisco, which is the largest gathering of the LGBT community in the world. There were over 1 million people. But I went to the more niche fairs. I went to Folsom. I went to Doreale. And when I returned, I kind of felt like home a bit. It's kind of strange to say that, but I understand why young people go to the LGBT community, because it is powerful. Because a lot of times you grow up feeling alienated, you feel unwanted, you feel lonely, you're depressed, you're anxious. I get it because I was there. So when I went back to there, I was like, wow, this is powerful. You have millions of people here, all sort of loving you and accepting you, and banners and parades and music and dancing and love and, all this stuff. I could kind of get into it again because I go, I'm home. These are my people. These people get me. It's trauma bonding in the worst sense. We all had similar childhoods, and we just kind of get it. So when I would talk to those people, I understand them, I think, and we understand each other in a sort of fundamental way. I think there's a lot of pain there. I'm not psychic or anything, but I think I have the ability, I think, sometimes to discern spirits a bit. And when I would go there, I mean, even when I go to Folsom and you see the most grotesque forms of sexual perversion on display, I didn't pick up a lot of evil. I picked up a lot of confusion, a lot of fear, those sort of emotions. That's what I picked up on, and it's not good. I felt a lot of empathy for these people, I guess, because it seems like in the summer, in conservative social media, you'll see like clips from Pride and people are disgusted and horrified, and it is gross. But when I was there, I felt a lot of empathy for these people. This is desperate. This is not good. I would just talk to them and say, let's pray for something. Do you have something you want to pray for? Something, your family? And you get a connection right away. And sometimes people, it's kind of remarkable, open up and say things about their childhood, that they had a lot of difficulty. I'm not kidding, because people never get asked. They're never in a vulnerable moment. And it's not that there isn't some sort of like religious presence there, because all of the pro-LGBT denominations have a presence there, but they don't do anything consequential. It's passing out rainbow buttons and Jesus loves you, and, you were born this way and God made you this way and all that stuff. But they don't dig any deeper.
What about the political apparatus that has driven this revolution through our culture and government? I also spoke with Elizabeth Woning, co-founder of the Changed Movement, which is based in Redding, California. For many years, she lived and identified as a lesbian and was part of a progressive denomination that was fully affirming of everything under the rainbow flag. An encounter with the Holy Spirit at a Pentecostal-type youth group changed her trajectory forever and ultimately transformed her thinking.
The whole politicization of LGBT came into my view, and I began turning from kind of the social justice mandate that I had formed in seminary. I had viewed the gospel as a social justice mandate. I began turning my attention from that to what it meant to worship a holy God. And those two collided. And it caused me to begin questioning, I would say in theological terms, how can I move from a postmodern reading of Scripture to a historical critical reading of Scripture? Because I found my context changing. And that caused a crisis. And it was that crisis really that began forcing me to redefine what I had believed about myself. So in my understanding of lesbian identity, it became much more than I'm born this way. I became aware of the whole political movement and the problems of the political movement and its impacts on the church and its effects on me and the telos of being a woman. And to get from the LGB to the T, how did LGB or the LGBT movement as we have known it, how did it set the stage for the T? Well, it redefined human ontology. It creates a unique personhood and a whole system and worldview around that personhood that is inconsistent with typical humanity. And so it allows us to dissociate from our bodies in many ways. And I think that is the on-ramp for now I'm dissociated from my body. And what I mean by that is it doesn't matter that I have a physically, biologically female body designed to bear children. My sexuality can be fully expressed with another woman. I don't need a man to complete me. And so as soon as I dissociate the full function of my physical body, then how many more steps do you have to take to even decide to become someone or something completely different biologically?
So, Elizabeth, how would you say the LGBTQ movement has morphed over the years? I mean, I hear some say that they don't even recognize it anymore. Some of them thought it was just about civil liberties, civil rights. Others are more suspicious that something much more nefarious was going on from the start. What's your read?
First of all, the conflation of LGBT as a political movement is, first of all, to blame. The LGBT movement as a political movement is a union of convenience for political authority. And so L and G should never have been together. Never. And lesbian experience is so diverse, in my opinion, in comparison to gay experience. So when this movement of political convenience became massive, I'd say in the late 70s and 80s, lesbianism then became redefined by what it means to be gay. And so now the narrative on who is a lesbian has become the same as who is gay. I'm just going to block out B for a while. So lesbianism has had many different expressions. It has had a political, ideological expression that was fully valid in culture in the 60s. And it wasn't really until we needed to have, or lesbians needed to have, an assertion that could not be ideological in order to become powerful as a subgroup to get anti-discrimination status, that lesbianism suddenly became this issue that is always a biological, etc., innate determinative reality. And so you have within a lesbian experience a very, very wide spectrum of sexual experiences. Some of it, born out of abuse or rejection of masculinity. Some of it is born out of gender incongruence or even gender wounds. Some of it is legitimately born out of sexual longings. To be a feminist is to be all women and to love women and to advance women's causes. And so you have this incredible spectrum within lesbianism. So of course, any of the lesbian movement that acknowledges that the gay narrative is misogynistic and has perversely been applied to lesbian experience is going to be at odds with T, no matter how you come at it. Because of the extremism in the political culture, no one can talk about what are the roots of the experiences. Nobody can talk about the formative factors of the experiences. No one can talk about the political factors involved with the beliefs and feelings. And so the suppression of all that under the surface information has gotten us to the point of now T is the extreme kind of fruit, I think, of the L and the G political movement and all of the ideologies and ideological factors that have gone into making it an authoritative political power in our culture. And so, you have the people who are affected by these ideologies. This is people like Chloe Cole, for example, in my opinion, a victim of these ideologies. And then you have people who might be like me, who found themselves with these desires and no answer for them other than the narrative that was presented to me by the political culture.
I realize that we've only just begun to scratch the surface. But there's an aspect to this space that I believe hasn't gotten enough attention, and I'd be remiss not to mention it. The pornography industry. How has it contributed to the gender morass? How has online smut furthered the chaos? I asked Jonathon Van Maren for his take.
The pornography industry didn't create transgenderism, but if you remove pornography from the equation, it takes 10 or 15 years longer for the transgender movement to get where it did for several reasons. The first reason is that pornography addiction comes when somebody begins to look at content, but the way pornography addiction functions differently than other addictions where you simply escalate usage of the same product. pornography addiction craves novelty. And so people increasingly look at more and more extreme content in order to get the same result. And so instead of drinking, 5 drinks as opposed to 2 drinks, you're actually, when it comes to pornography, you're no longer looking at what would be considered hardcore porn 10 years ago. You're looking at bizarre transgender porn. And your brain is being shaped by the material that you are watching. Your frontal cortex is being rewired, and you are wiring your arousal patterns to what you are viewing. And people say, well, you've got one brain for fantasy and one brain for reality, but it's the same brain and everything bleeds together. And so on one hand, what we have is people whose sexuality is being formed by the content that they are consuming online. And just the act of viewing pornography utterly changes somebody's plausibility structures and makes the Christian sexual ethic seem bizarre and foreign. If you had told the great-great-grandparents of anybody listening that a majority of young heterosexual men would enjoy watching footage that included an aroused male, they would have stared at you in total bewilderment. They would not be able to understand how this was actually taking place. And yet that is the case. And so already what pornography is doing is it's utterly demolishing people's instinctive plausibility structures and opening them up to a wide range of sexual experiences, which is, again, one of the things that LGBT activists have openly stated are driving this idea that people are into pretty much any kind of body, from any kind of sex or any kind of gender. And so obviously pornography is fueling for men pornography, because for many transgenderism is just the fantasy of finding sexual completion through themselves. Autogenophilia, it's called, imagining themselves as a woman and being aroused by that fact. And the other way that this is transforming a generation, again, is because women are growing up in a world shaped by Pornhub. And that is a fact that every single person must grapple with, because you cannot understand the growing hostility between men and women. You cannot understand the gender wars. You cannot understand transgenderism. You can't understand the polarized war between young women and the manosphere without understanding that the world young women are going into is shaped by pornography. It's a profoundly hostile world. And any young woman who is not fearful of a landscape in which the majority of young men have been seeing girls get abused since they were 13, 14 years old is not thinking clearly. And so what we're seeing is essentially these different ideologies that went off like bombs in our culture, but pornography is the scorched earth final assault of the sexual revolution that levels everything, because it invades all the physical boundaries that Christian communities so carefully set up and obliterates everything in its path.
So what's ahead if this isn't stopped? Do you think it can go any further? It really kind of makes me shudder to think about it for too long, but are we headed for the mainstreaming and the normalization of, say, polyamory or even pedophilia?
If you take a laundry list of the sexual revolutionaries whose worldviews and whose ideologies created the society that we live in now, you find the ideas of pedophilia at the bottom of it every time. And our memory is very, very short. But the reason this is so important for all the listeners to remember is if we are going to look at the much maligned Christians of the religious right of the 70s and 80s, they were right about everything. They were right about everything, and their critics were wrong. Mary Whitehouse of the UK, for example, roundly mocked for warning about the sexualization of children. Bans on child porn only essentially exist because of her activism. She was right about all this stuff. Who was wrong at the same time she was being mocked by the BBC? It was the Campaign for Homosexual Equality in the UK, which is now much lauded as an organization seeking gay equality, but twice voted in favor of the pedophile information exchange, an organization that openly advocated for relationships between children and adults, and was even interviewed very calmly by the BBC at the time. And so when we ask ourselves, why do we see the sexualization of children taking place that allows us to experiment on them with puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and sex change surgeries? Why are we seeing Drag Queen Story Hour, where you have sexualized performers reading to kids? Why are we seeing sex education that's increasingly explicit and graphic being taught to kids? You have to recognize that they tried this before. The first wave of the sexual revolution got halted at child sexual abuse. They're back again. They're doing the same thing. And one of the darkest aspects of the transgender movement is that the pedophile community is enormously enthusiastic by every gain the trans movement makes. Why? Because if a child can consent to be castrated, if a child can consent to go on puberty blockers, If a child can consent to a double mastectomy, then surely they can consent to sex with an adult.
So, Nathanael, do you think we've reached the dead end of the sexual revolution?
I want to hope that in God's grace we have reached the end and there will be a turning point. I think things can get worse. There are new sins, horrible sins that could become more mainstream. I hope they won't. We've certainly seen that push, though. It's when it seemed like transgenderism was winning, there was in that push for polyamory. We could certainly see that followed by a push towards pedophilia. We saw that in the 70s. People forget about that, but it was a real movement, especially in Europe, but also in the United States, that sought to sexualize children and to normalize that. And it was a real thing with major intellectuals behind it. And every once in a while, again, particularly in Europe, you'll see a politician get called out because it turns out that back then they were all on board with this and now they're a respected politician and oops, their writings resurface. We've seen evils come and thankfully on that recede a bit. I hope we've reached a point where this evil of transgenderism will recede and not continue on and give birth to even worse, or at least more diverse and novel forms so that there's an entire buffet of sin. We've already got enough selection. But I think it's going to be God's grace and then the church and people being faithful in the church, preaching and proclaiming the truth in the world. If we see this turning, it will be that combination. And again, it's mysterious, that mix of human effort and divine providence. So I'm not going to start trying to assign percentages or anything like that. That it's not how it works. But we need to be faithful. And then we need to trust and hope that and pray that God will deliver us from evil rather than handing us over to our sins as a nation and a culture.
Thank you for listening to this season of Generation Indoctrination. At the Christian Post, you can be sure that we will remain vigilant. We will continue reporting on these issues, and our frontline news coverage and opinion commentary will track changes as they unfold. And stay tuned for our Season 5 bonus episode, coming soon.